Can you remember which teachers taught you to read literature during your formative years? What values did they convey to you? Did they show you how to pay attention to the representation of violence against women that so often appears in text? Do you really believe in the ideological neutrality of literary education? The Resistance Reading Project wants to help you discover new ways of reading literary works that represent violence against women, placing the gender perspective at the centre. Mercè Rodoreda y Gurgi, in Diamond Square. Mercè Rodoreda y Gurgi, 1908 to 1983, is considered one of the most influential voices in 20th century Catalan literature. Her work spans various genres: novels, short stories, theatre, poetry, and painting. In the brief overview of her work that we are about to present, the titles are given in English, although the year indicated corresponds to their original publication in Catalan. In 1932, she published her first novel, Am I an Honest Woman? This was then followed by From Which There Is No Escape, 1934, A Day in the Life of a Man, 1934, and Crime, 1936. In 1938, she won the Joan Creixas Prize with Aloma, considered her first realistic and mature work, although 30 years later she decided to rewrite and republish it in 1969. The Spanish Civil War and Francoist repression forced her into exile in 1939. She left behind a broken marriage and a son. In Rossy-en-Brie, a chateau near Paris where she took refuge along with other Catalan writers and intellectuals, she began a romantic relationship with Armand Obiols, the pseudonym of the literary critic and writer Joan Prat, who also left his wife and daughter in Catalonia. From that moment, and with the outbreak of the Second World War, the two embarked on a painful journey across a Europe torn apart by conflict, constantly struggling to survive, until they finally settled in Geneva in 1954, where Obiols attained a position as a translator at the UN. That economic and emotional stability marked the beginning of an intense creative period for Rodoreda. She collected scattered short stories and published 22 stories in 1958. At the end of the 1950s and early 1960s, the author submitted several works for literary prizes. In Diamond Square, originally titled Pidgey, did not win the 1960s St. George Prize, but Joan Fuster, a member of the Journey, recommended it to the publisher Joan Sales, who published it 2 years later through Club Editor. This milestone marked the beginning of the intense and fruitful relationship between author and publisher, as well as the consolidation of Rodoreda's reputation as a writer, as demonstrated by the numerous awards she received for her subsequent works. In 1966, she published Camellia Street, awarded with several prizes. Later came the collection My Christina and Other Stories in 1967. In 1974, after Obiols' death and her return to Catalonia, one of her most important works was published, The Broken Mirror, the intense and legendary novel about a family saga across 3 generations. She then published several volumes of stories. It Seemed Like Silk and Other Stories, 1978, All the Stories, 1979, and Journeys and Flowers, 1980. War, So Much War, 1980, was her last novel, confirming the symbolic turn she had begun in this period. In 1980, she received the honorary prize for Catalan letters and died 3 years later in 1983. Posthumously, 2 unfinished novels were published, Death in Spring, 1986, and Isabella Maria, 1991. In Diamond Square is considered Mercè Rodoreda's most emblematic work and a landmark of post-war Catalan literature, due to the significant editorial and critical impact it had at the time, marking a turning point in the author's career. The novel recounts, in the first person, the life of Natalia, a shy woman without her own voice, living in Barcelona during the Second Republic, the Spanish Civil War, and the post-war period. Orphaned of her mother, Natalia must find her way through life amid hardship and pain. Her husband Joe, manipulative and selfish, gives her the name Colometa Pidgey, meaning little dove, with a symbolic dimension, as we shall see, and subjects her to psychological abuse that diminishes her dignity. Motherhood becomes oppressive, and the war, misery, and hunger drive her to a desperate suicide attempt, ultimately prevented by Anthony, the pharmacist who senses her intentions, offering her work and later a loving refuge. Pidgey then becomes Mrs. Natalia and faces the final stage of her life with hope. In Diamond Square represents the culmination of Mercè Rodoreda's literary career, an intimate, poetic, and psychological narrative that channels pain, resilience, and the restoration of identity. Through Natalia Pidgey, the author provides a perspective that is both collective and individual, portraying historical wounds as well as the possibility of personal redemption. Her masterful use of interior monologue and first-person voice creates an intimacy with the reader, transforming the narrative into a sensitive and universal testimony of human experience in adverse times.
The young man moved even closer and laughed.
Aren't you too young to have a fiancé?
And when he laughed, his lips parted, and I could see all his teeth. He had little monkey eyes and wore a blue-striped white shirt, open at the collar, and his armpits were soaked with sweat. And he suddenly turned his back on me, stood on tiptoe, swung round again, swayed this way and that, and said,
"Sorry,"
and shouted,
"Hey, anyone seen my jacket? It was on the chair next to the musicians. Hey!"
And he said someone had stolen his jacket and he'd be back straight away, and he hoped I'd wait. He started shouting,
Any.
All green embroidered canary yellow, Julie appeared from nowhere and said,
"Hide me! I've just got to take these shoes off. I can't dance another step."
I told her I couldn't budge because the young man who was looking for his jacket wanted to dance with me, and he had begged me to wait. I danced up and down, and he seemed a long way away, even though he was really very close, whispering,
"Look how well she dances."
And a strong whiff of sweat and stale eau de cologne hit me, and I was eyeball to eyeball with his sparkling monkey eyes and little metal-like ears. And that elastic cutting into my waist, and my mother dead and gone and not around to give me advice, because I told him my boyfriend was a cook at the Columbus, and he laughed and said he was very sorry for his sake because I'd be his wife and darling within a year. And we danced the lucky posy dance in Diamond Square. He said,
"My darling,"
and said I'd be his wife within a year, and I'd not even taken a good look at him, and now I did. And he said,
"Don't stare at me like that, or they'll have to pick me up off the floor."
And that was when I told him hiccup monkey eyes. And he laughed till he cried. The elastic round my waist cut into me like a knife, and the musicians tra-la-la, tra-li-li. And Julie was nowhere to be seen. She'd vanished. And his eyes looked deep into mine, as if the whole world was in them, and there was no escape. And the night sped on under the great bear in the sky, and the party sped on, and the girl in blue with the posy whirled round and round. My mother 6 feet under in San Gervasi, and me here in Diamond Square. When the waltz ended, people began to leave. I said I'd lost Julie, and he said he'd lost Ernie, and when we were all alone and everyone was in bed and the streets empty, he said,
"You and I will dance a dawn waltz in Diamond Square. Round and round, Pidgey."
I looked at him taken aback and told him my name was Natalia. And when I said my name was Natalia, he laughed again and said there could only be one name for me. Pidgey. That was when I broke into a run and he chased me.
"Don't be scared. Don't you see that we can't walk down these streets by yourself? Someone will see you right from me."
And he grabbed my arm and stopped me in my tracks.
"Don't you see someone will steal you away, Pidgey?"
And my mother, dead, and me stuck there with the elastic cutting deep into my waist like a piece of wire tying me to a frond of asparagus fern.
This fragment opens the plot of the novel. The scene takes place in a marquee at the Gracia Festival in the Diamond Square, where Natalia goes with her friend Julie. There she meets Joe, who approaches her very directly and assures her that within a year they will be married. Natalia, who is already engaged, cannot resist the hypnotic power that this man exerts over her, and in an atmosphere that becomes increasingly oppressive, dances with him while the process of her loss of identity begins. When he calls her Pidgey, by leaving behind her real name, she also abandons the life she had led up to that moment. In the text, we witness a clear example of Rodoreda's poetic style. The protagonist's monologue, imbued with an oral tone that intertwines with the thread of her thoughts, perfectly conveys her view of the world. Naive, simple, devoted to happiness and to the will of those around her. The excitement of what could be the beginning of a new love, however, is overshadowed by details that obsessively foreshadow the dynamics of psychological violence looming over her. The elastic band around her waist tightens more and more. She feels she cannot escape his gaze, intense and animal-like. His eyes look deep into mine as if the whole world was in them, she says. She laments the absence of her mother and also the fact that she cannot find Julie, who, dressed in the colours of birds, behaves freely, and in time will represent the antithesis of the traditional role embodied by Natalia. Thus, in the midst of the Diamond Square and surrounded by people, Natalia feels alone, lacking a female figure to protect her from the threat of becoming Joe's little dove, whom he already considers his possession. "Don't you see someone will steal you away, Pidgey," he says, and who harasses her when she tries to escape that fate. All this takes place in an open space where the music, the crowd, and the night contribute, paradoxically, to the protagonist's sense of disorientation and isolation. While far from the noise and from the story's just beginning, in the cemetery of San Geresi lies the longed-for maternal figure.
There he was, on the corner of the street. What a surprise on a day when I wasn't expecting him.
I want you to stop working for that pastry cook. I've heard all about how he chases after his shop girls.
I started shaking and told him to stop shouting, that I couldn't leave my job just like that, so rudely, without a decent excuse, that the poor fellow never had an ill word to say about me, that I liked selling cakes, and if he forced me to give up, what would I do? He said that one dark, wintry afternoon he'd come to see me at work. And he said that when I was helping a customer to choose a box of chocolates from the right-hand window, the pastry cook's eyes had trailed not after me, but after my behind. I told him not to be silly and that we might as well forget it if he couldn't trust me.
I do trust you, but I don't want that pastry cook having a good time at your expense.
You're mad, I told him. He only ever thinks about his business, get it? I was so angry my cheeks flushed a bright red. He grabbed me by the throat and shook my head. I told him to clear off, and if he didn't, I'd go to the police. We didn't see one another for 3 weeks, and just when I was beginning to regret telling Pete it was all over between us, because at the end of the day, Pete was a good lad who'd never been nasty to me and was only a good worker who was crazy about his job, Joe turned up, cool as a cucumber. And the first thing he said, stuffing his hands into his pockets, was,
"Poor Mary, sent packing because of you."
We had another row in the middle of the week because of Joe's obsession with the pastry cook.
"If I see him staring at your behind again, I'll go in and he'll be the worse for wear,"
he shouted. He disappeared for a couple of days, and when he re-emerged, I asked him if he'd got over it, and he strutted like a rooster and said I had some explaining to do because he'd seen me out with Pete. I said he must have mistaken me for another girl. He said it was me. I swore it wasn't, and he said it was. At first, I spoke quietly, but as he didn't believe me, I started screaming. And when he heard me, he said all girls were crazy and rubbish. And I asked him where he'd seen me out with Pete.
"In the street."
But which street?
"In the street."
But which street? Which street? He marched off. I didn't sleep that night. He came back in the morning and said I must promise never to go out with Pete again and all that business. And he'd never lose temper with me again. I said, all right, and I'd never go out with Pete again. Instead of being pleased, he flew into a rage and said he was sick of me lying, that he'd set a trap for me and caught me like a mouse, and he said I should beg for forgiveness for going for a walk with Pete. And I told him I hadn't. But in the end, he made me believe I had. And that was when he told me to get down on my knees. In the middle of the street?
Kneel down inside your head.
And he made me beg for forgiveness down on my knees, inside my head, because I'd gone for a walk with Pete, who, poor soul, I hadn't seen since we'd split up.
In these two passages, which are thematically connected but belongs to chapters 3 and 4 of the novel respectively, we witness the continuation of the process of control and eradication of identity to which Jo subjects Natalia. In this case, psychological violence takes the form of exacerbated jealousy, which in addition distorts reality and pushes the protagonist into a dead end of lies from which she finds it impossible to escape. Thus, in the first passage, Jo forces Natalia to leave the pastry shop where she works because, according to him, the owner looks at her with dishonest intentions. In reality, denying her a source of economic independence and depriving her of any kind of contact with other men forms part of his strategy to isolate her. The argument escalates into physical violence. He grabbed me by the throat and shook my head. And this time, Natalia reacts firmly, defends herself. I told him to clear off, and if he didn't, I'd go to the police. And she recalls with longing the calm and kind nature of Pete, the young man to whom she was engaged when she met Jo. However, after several weeks without seeing him, he reappears to apply another of his manipulative tactics, the mention of a certain Maria who, according to his occasional remarks, seems to be a woman he left in order to court Natalia. In fact, as Jo's friends later confirmed to Natalia, that relationship never existed. It is nothing more than a way to torment her, as if she were responsible for having destroyed another woman's happiness and were failing to make the most of the opportunity, being with Jo, that fate had supposedly offered her. Therefore, the initial lie, Maria never existed, is compounded by a lack of information, which subjects Natalia to a spiral of questions and speculations that make her feel guilty of an imaginary crime she has not committed. The same strategy can be seen in the passage from chapter 4, when Jo accuses Natalia of having seen her former fiancé. This is yet another falsehood designed to continue undermining Natalia's confidence and autonomy. Although she denies the accusation, faced with his irrational obsession, she ends up confused, losing trust in her own perception of reality, and finally gives in. The process of silencing and manipulating Natalia becomes firmly established in their relationship, culminating in a painful and humiliating final scene. By forcing her to kneel before him and beg forgiveness, he destroys her self-esteem and her ability to defend herself, something she has still been able to muster in the previous scene. The protagonist's growing anguish is conveyed to us throughout the pages of the novel, through an intense polyphony in which the voices of others, especially that of Jo, intrude upon and control Natalia's discourse, and through an apparently spontaneous narration that allows us to feel her pain and helplessness.
We'd been married for 2 months and 1 week. I stood opposite him and he stared and didn't say a word, and stayed like that for a good while until I couldn't stand it anymore, and he simply kept staring. In the half-dark, his eyes seemed even smaller and more sunken, and when I thought I couldn't stand it anymore, he shot up like a jet of water, splayed his hands in the air as if the skin between his fingers was about to split, and chased after me shouting, "Whoa, whoa, 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 whoa!" I dashed down the passage with Joe in hot pursuit. Whoa, 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 whoa. I ran into our bedroom and he came after me and shoved me onto the floor and kicked me under the bed and jumped on top of the bed. When I tried to come out, he slapped the top of my head and shouted,
"Naughty girl!"
And whichever side I tried to come out on, slap!
"Naughty girl!"
Afterwards, he played that same trick on me lots of times. On the Sundays when we didn't go out because it was raining and Ernie and Matthew didn't come, we'd spend the afternoon in the bed with the honey-colored columns made from those wooden balls. And when we were having lunch, he'd declare,
"We'll make a baby today."
And he made me see stars. Mrs. Enriqueta had been dropping heavy hints for some time about really wanting to know what my wedding night had been like. But I didn't dare because we didn't have a wedding night. We had a wedding week. I was terrified in my little corner. And when he got into bed after setting me an example, as he'd said, I started taking my clothes off. I'd always been afraid of that moment. People had told me it's a path of roses getting that far and a path of tears from then on. And they make you happy just to disappoint. Because from my childhood, I'd heard people say they split you open. And I'd always been really afraid of being split open and dying. Women, people would say, die split asunder. You start to suffer the day you marry. And if you're not properly split open, the midwife will complete the job with a knife or a bit of a broken bottle, and then you stay like that forever, gutted or sewn up. And that's why married women get tired so quickly if they have to stand up for any length of time. And that's why gentlemen who are in the know stand up when the tram is packed and women are standing and insist they sit down, and gentlemen who aren't remain seated. And when I started to cry, Joe lifted his head above the turn of the blanket and asked what was wrong, and I told him the truth. I was afraid of being split open and dying. And he laughed and said he'd certainly heard of a case, Queen Bustamante, whose husband had a horse split her open to save himself the bother and she died. And Joe laughed himself silly. That was why I couldn't tell Miss Enriqueta about my wedding night, because the day we went to live in our flat, Joe sent me off to get supplies in and then locked and bolted the door, and we had a week of wedding nights. All the same, I told Miss Enriqueta about the case of Queen Bustamante, and she said, yes, that was horrific, but what her husband did to her was even more horrific. That husband, the rain had been watering for years, ever since he'd kicked the bucket. He'd tied her to their bed as if she'd been crucified because she was always trying to run away.
In these passages, we can see that physical and sexual violence, in addition to psychological violence, are a constant feature of Natalia's everyday life. In the first, from chapter 7, we witness the infantilization to which Joe subjects her through a macabre and absurd joke in which he humiliates her once again with a kind of punishment for an unknown reason, chasing her around the house like a ghost and instilling in her a irrational fear, since there is no explanation for his behavior. Particularly striking is the reference to his gaze, described by Natalia from a place of panic. In the half-dark, his eyes seemed even smaller and more sunken, as it connects with the overwhelming feeling of the moment they first met and reinforces the idea of control he seeks to exercise over her body and mind. In the second, from chapter 8, we find a stark depiction of the sexual violence Natalia suffers, and also a reference to that endured by Mrs. Enriqueta while her husband was alive. The imposition of sex, "We'll make a baby today," and her pain, "He made me see stars," speak to us of marital rape, an ordeal that the protagonist faces with fear and profound ignorance about everything related to physical intimacy between a man and a woman. The patriarchal taboo that has silenced and trivialized the sexual act through all kinds of legends in which the woman is always the victim and never a person with her own desire and will, manifests itself in Natalia's terror before her wedding night, which Joe prolongs for an entire week. Faced with her tears, he reacts by ridiculing her and deepening her insecurity with another grotesque and cruel story in which the abuse and death of the woman becomes a source of amusement. From this passage, the figure of Mrs. Enriqueta is particularly noteworthy. For Natalia, she provides practical support, serving symbolically as a substitute for her dead mother, and shows concern for her neighbour's well-being, although she often acts as a mouthpiece for patriarchal thought. By contrast, the character of Julie, who appears at key moments in the story, not coincidentally, it is her name that opens the novel, functions as a counterpoint to Natalia's unhappy life and also to what Mrs. Enriqueta represents. She brings her chocolates when her child is born because, as she says, no one remembers the mother, joins the militia, practices free love, and later helps her friend when sunk in poverty. Natalia brings her son to be fed at the orphanage for war children where Julie works.
And that was the day when I told myself, enough was enough. I had enough of those pigeons. Dump the lot. Pigeons, bird seed, troughs, trays, boxes, and stepladder. But I didn't know how. The thoughts smoldered in my brain like an ember. And while Joe was having breakfast with his legs wound round the rungs of his chair, he suddenly unwound one, flexed his foot in the air, and said perhaps he'd got a red-hot coal in his knee, and it was making his bones boil. And all I could think about was putting an end to our pigeon colony. And every word Joe said went in one ear and out the other, as if I'd driven a hole through from one to the other. I felt the embers burning bright inside my brain. Seed, troughs, trays, pigeon loft and baskets for pigeon shit, dump the lot. Stepladder, esparto grass, croppers, beady bloodshot eyes, and red legs, dump the lot. Fantails, cows, nuns, pigeons, big and small, dump the lot. I want my terrace back, the trapdoor nailed down, my chairs back in the attic, the pigeon rung cut off, my washing basket on the terrace, and my clothes hanging out to dry on the terrace. Dump the gimlet eyes and the sharp beaks, the rainbow mauve and rainbow apple green. Quite unawares, Joe's mother had given me the solution. I started upsetting the pigeons when they were brooding. I used the time the kids were asleep after lunch to go up to the roof and torment the pigeons. The attic was steaming like a hot oven. All the morning sun beat down on the roof and made it fry. And the body heat from broody pigeons and the stench their bodies gave off, and it was like hell.
The fragment we have just listened to belongs to a crucial moment in the novel's plot. We accompany the protagonist through the process of awakening and overcoming the trauma caused by the male violence that almost destroyed her. This passage from chapter 25 marks the point at which Natalia rebels against the invasion that the pigeons have come to represent in her life. A leitmotif at this stage of the novel conveys her sense of claustrophobia, enslavement and subjugation. The arrival of the pigeons in the house is Joe's decision, as he intends to breed them, but it is Natalia who suffers the consequences of their progressive and overwhelming presence. Thousands of little eyes and tiny feet watching her and dirtying everything. At first, they are confined to the dovecote on the rooftop, but in time they end up inside the house, tormenting and spying on Natalia Pidgey in a clear and eloquent parallel. She has become just another of the little creatures under Joe's rule. However, she is also trapped by the role that motherhood imposes on her. She must take care of the house, the husband, the son, the daughter, and now the pigeons. And it is significantly her strategy of attacking the eggs, shaking them so that they spoil, that marks a turning point in her loss of identity. By cutting off the future of the pigeons, Jo's whim, she symbolically halts the process of dispossession and degradation of her dignity that he has subjected her to since the day they met. The power and beauty of this passage lie in the metonymic enumerations that, as if through a film camera, focus on partial details of the infernal scene, intensified by the heat of the rooftop and the apocalyptic atmosphere, with references to parts of the animals' bodies that torment the protagonist and to the tools surrounding them, creating an impressionistic tableau of horror. The repetition of "dump the lot" accompanying each stage of destruction expresses Natalia's rage and the point of no return she has reached, now that every word Jo said went in one ear and out the other, as if I'd driven a hole through from one end to the other. Immune to his voice at last, this moment represents the beginning of the end of her enslavement.
I'd gone in through that door for years and years as Jo's wife, and had left through it to marry Anthony, trailing my kids behind me. The street was ugly, the building was ugly, and the paving was paving fit only for carts and horses. The street lamp was a long way away and the entrance was dingy. I looked for the hole Jo had made in the door, above the keyhole, and found it straight away, packed with cork right above the keyhole. I started scraping out bits of cork with the point of my knife, and the cork crumbled and fell out. And I removed it all, and then I realized I couldn't go in. My fingers couldn't reach the string in order to pull it and yank the door open. I should have brought a piece of wire to hook onto the string, and I was about to knock on the door, but thought it would make too much noise and hit the wall instead and hurt myself badly. And I turned round and rested and felt it was very early in the morning. And I looked at the door, and with the point of the knife curved out, pitchy, in deep grooves, and not thinking, I started walking and followed the walls rather than my footsteps, and came to Diamond Square. A box of old houses with the sky for a lid. And I saw small shadows flying at the center of the lid, and the houses started rocking to and fro, as if they'd plunged into water and somebody was slowly stirring the water, and the house walls began to stretch up and lean into each other, and the lid space kept narrowing into a funnel. And I felt a hand in mine, and it was Matthew's, and a satin-tie pigeon settled on his shoulder, the like of which I'd never seen before. A rainbow sheen on its feathers, and I heard a stormy wind gusting around the funnel that was almost closed by now, and I put my arms over my face to save me from whatever was about to happen and let out a scream from hell. A scream I must have been carrying deep inside me for years, and a little something else ran from my mouth alongside that scream that was so vast it was hard to get out of my throat, like a cockroach made from saliva. And that little something else that had been shut up inside me for so long was my youth, that now rushed out screaming something or other. That I'd been forsaken?
The passage we have just listened to belongs to chapter 49, which closes the novel. Natalia has endured a sea of pain and misery. After the revolution of the pigeons, the Spanish Civil War breaks out. Jo dies on the Aragon front, and she, who had worked for a time as a cleaner, is dismissed for belonging to the losing side. Hunger and despair, as mentioned earlier in the introduction to the novel, drive her and her children to the brink of suicide, but Anthony's intervention saves her from death, and sometime later they marry. Anthony, who was wounded in the war and is unable to have sexual relations, represents a model of masculinity completely opposed to Jo's. He is a good, kind, and sensitive man with whom Natalia experiences a relationship based on mutual support. Leaving Jo behind, she recovers her name. Everyone now calls her Mrs. Natalia. Before the scene we have just heard, the plot has described the protagonist's quieter life. Her daughter has married in the previous chapter, although the memory of Jo and the fear of his return, his body was never recovered from the front, still haunt her frequently. One night, she gets up in the early hours, almost unconsciously walks towards the house they once shared and tries to enter it. When she cannot, she writes on the wall with the knife, a phallic, violent symbol charged with vengeance, her old nickname Pitchy, to inscribe metaphorically the woman she once was and to face the future free from the burden of painful memories. She then goes to the place where everything began, the Diamond Square, which, like in a nightmare, seems to swirl into a claustrophobic vortex around her until everything bursts into a liberating, cathartic scream that finally breaks the hellish spell of memory. Noteworthy is the allusion to the ghost of Matthew, a friend of Joe's with whom Natalia had built a trusting relationship. He was executed during the war, and represents a very different kind of man, with blue eyes that symbolize the innocence, capacity for love, and honesty that defined him. The pigeon that accompanies her has now become a myth, stripped of the demonic power it once held over Natalia. Together with the image of the funnel that the square forms above her, we find two of the novel's most significant symbols. Indeed, the image of the funnel, which Natalia once considered using to pour acid down her children's throats and thus ending the living death they were enduring, also shatters along with the piercing noise of the past, finally released in the form of a scream that is almost tangible, almost organic. This reading of In Diamond Square, approached from a gender perspective and focused on the male violence inflicted upon Natalia, reveals the process of loss and recovery of identity and dignity experienced by a woman who, from a position of utter vulnerability, managed to take control of her destiny and awaken to life. The context of war, however, is especially cruel to the anonymous women who, from the home front, strive to sustain the families left behind by men, and who later suffer the brutal repression inflicted upon the defeated. In Diamond Square, translated into nearly 40 languages, is an example of how profoundly local, poetic, and oral prose can tell a story of universal scope, one that resonates with an equally authentic and moving rhythm, even in worlds far removed from 20th century Barcelona.
Àngels Francés is the author of the commentary on In Diamond Square by Mercè Rodoreda, translated into English by Peter Bush, which you have just heard. This podcast features narration by Laura Stiles, who gives voice to the literary interpretation by Àngels Francés. Alexandra Malitska is Natalia, and Andrew Bradley as Joe. It forms part of the Resistant Readings project coordinated by Teresa Iribarren. Francés' critical commentary was supported by a grant for research dissemination projects in Catalan literature, awarded by the Department of Culture of the Government of Catalonia. This podcast was recorded in the Sound Experimentation Laboratory of the Interdisciplinary Research and Innovation Hub at the Open University of Catalonia.